Hello BookTube. In this video I want to show you some rock and roll novels. But before we get into this rock and roll book show, I say we get some psychedelics into us. This is Nog, A Head Venture by Rudolf Wurlitzer from 1968. And it says, Nog is to literature what Dylan is to lyrics. And first of all, I thought Rudolf Wurlitzer has to be a pseudonym, but it isn't. And yes, Rudolf Wurlitzer is a descendant of the Wurlitzer family who founded the company of the same name that makes the Wurlitzer organs. And this isn't music fiction, but being written by a Wurlitzer and with the Dylan comparison on the cover, I thought I'd show it off here. Is Rocktober a reading event when you read music fiction in October? If so, these things usually have an anything goes prompt, and I think this would work perfectly for that. And this book is blurbed by Thomas Pynchon on the back, who says, "The novel of bullshit is dead." And I don't know what that means, but you could probably open this book up anywhere and start reading it, and it wouldn't matter because the main character is going to be just as lost as you are. I'll give you a dose of Nog. One of my favorite lines is, I picked up a can of beans. I must have picked up a can of beans because I can remember putting a can of beans back on the shelf and picking up another, a bottle of beans. And that's our main character who keeps himself as close as he can to not existing. Like, he's boiled his mind down to just a few absurd memories and will not let himself remember anything else or absorb any of his surroundings. But he is on the move in this kind of meditative state with no idea where he's just come from or what he's doing or where he's going. And he's getting into all sorts of bizarro situations. And it's a good book. It's super psychedelic, but there is like a counterculture subtext there that could be read deeper into. But it is like a literary drug, a head venture. And now that we're on book drugs, we're ready for this rock fiction show. So let's get into it. I'll show you my Rocktober picks. So we'll start off with what's probably the most famous book I'm going to show you. This is Spider Kiss, originally titled Rockabilly by Harlan Ellison from 1961. And it's famous for being the only book that's ever been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And it's basically the rise and fall of Luther Sellers, aka Stag Preston. And it is a good book, but it lacks the psychedelic, magical realism that I think works so well in rock novels. Which is kind of funny because I guess Harlan Ellison assaulted the CEO of the publishing company for labeling this as science fiction. But I wish it was more science fiction. I want that rock and roll fantasy with outrageous, larger-than-life characters like Nick Cohen's Johnny Angelo. I did a whole review of this book already. Apparently, David Bowie said it inspired Ziggy Stardust. And in that video, I showed Arthur, Teenage Pinball Queen, which is kind of rock and roll adjacent and would work for your anything goes prompt if Rocktober is indeed a BookTube event. Because this has a history with The Who and the song Pinball Wizard, which I'll get into another time. I'm just showing these ones off again for the sake of a rock novels video. But yeah, I want the trippy stuff. I'm looking for that hallucinatory rock and roll fever dream. I'm looking for something like The Phantom of the Paradise. And to those of you who know what this is, I'll give you time to settle down while I explain it to the people who don't. This is a movie novelization of a rock and roll horror musical parody from 1974. Pre-Rocky Horror Picture Show. And I guess the film bombed everywhere except Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, where it became an instant cult classic. And it was such a local sensation that some 40 years later, a documentary was filmed called The Phantom of Winnipeg. And they interview fans who are talking about how many times they saw it in the movie theaters and showing off their Phantom and Death Records tattoos. And I'd never heard of this movie until I found this book, but I've seen it now and I'm definitely a fan. And I live in Ontario, which is the next province to the east of Manitoba, and I found this in a bookstore here, so the cult following must have trickled over a bit. And for the good people of Winnipeg, I'll do a dedicated video for this one. But in the meantime, if you haven't seen this movie, definitely check it out. It's totally an outrageous rock and roll fever dream that takes inspiration from the Phantom of the Opera and Faust, and in a bizarre plot twist, The Picture of Dorian Gray. So watch the movie and stay tuned for a review of the novelization. But moving on, here's another great example of the outrageous. I found this one in the science fiction section. And this is The Electronic Lullaby Meat Market by John Spencer from 1975. And John Spencer was a singer, songwriter, and musician. You can stream his stuff online. But he was also involved in book publishing and founded an art agency in the 60s called Young Artists, which is still going, but it's now called Arena. And on the back of this book, it gives him credit for the cover concept, which I thought was cool because I don't think authors usually have much input on their book covers. So this whole book is very much an art piece of John Spencer's. And this book is very unique, borderline experimental even. Each chapter starts with a brief explanation of what's to come, like Chapter 1, or how Scarlet Crimson almost but not quite upset the balance of the universe and so neatly avoided immortality. And then it gives us the scenario of each chapter in italics before it plays out. But the overall scenario is that in every bedroom there's a device that lulls the population to sleep every night with these electronic lullabies. And it broadcasts the calming face of the lullaby's creator on your ceiling or wall. And these lullaby creators are the equivalent to pop stars. And there's two main guys who make these things. And they have a rivalry. And as I recall, they have hits out on one another. But it turns out that things aren't quite what they seem in the music industry. And the faces that the device broadcasts aren't even the guys making the lullabies. So it's kind of out to expose how fake the music industry is. But the story is an experimental mashup of all pulp fiction genres. Like we follow a hard-boiled PI type in a science fiction setting with characters from high fantasy. There's sleaze, drugs, and rock and roll, and superheroes. And it's a comedy. The stronger these superheroes are, the lower their IQ. There's one who, in the heat of the moment, will start punching out anybody, including the good guys. Or at one point, our PI is on a stakeout, camp out on the edge of town with his love interest. And things are getting romantic when he's needed in an emergency meeting in the city. So one of the superheroes comes swooping down faster than a speeding bullet and snatches him off the girl and flies him over the city and in through the window of a skyscraper office building and into a chair at the meeting. But yeah, it's definitely a creative one. And here's another one I found in the science fiction section. Rock the Big Rock by John Victor Peterson, published by Curtis Books in 1970. And in this one we follow the rather unlikable Jack Frank, who the back of the book describes as the supreme idol of the young generation, movie star, stage star, and rock and roll singer beyond compare. But a meteor is scheduled to wipe out civilization, and Jack Frank gets frozen in cryo and wakes up after the apocalypse in a primitive yet technologically advanced future, because some of the humans did manage to survive and have been repopulating and rebuilding. But in the future, when Jack Frank emerges from where he was hidden and meets these people, he finds that they've been worshiping him like a god. and they think this is his second coming. Because in the final hours before the meteor hit, all the religious leaders were out in the streets preparing the masses for Judgment Day. So no religion survived. And at the end, the most idolized figure was Jack Frank. He was everywhere and on everything. So naturally, the new civilization thinks that all his old records and promotional material are old religious relics. So all these new religious fundamentalists are rockers. But Jack Frank realizes pretty quickly that these people are worshiping a persona that he himself has little to do with. It takes a whole team of writers and producers and choreographers and managers and makeup, wardrobe, etc. to make Jack Frank what he's popular for. And on his own, he's just a regular guy. But in a nutshell, the author clearly condemns idolizing celebrities and is trying here to expose them as fakes and say that behind all the glitter, they're only human with the potential to be unlikable, like Jack Frank. But let's transition from sci-fi rock to acoustic pop. And this is an excellent segue because this too is a Curtis book from 1971, Terror by Night by Vic Krumm. And this is a Partridge Family TV tie-in novel. And the Partridge Family being 5 kids and their widowed mother who form a family band and tour the country in an old painted-up school bus. And in this one, the band are vacationing and practicing in an old mansion on a hill just outside of Salem. So there's witch vibes, but also stolen treasure and a police shootout. But we'll move on with some more acoustic pop. Like this. And this is a weird one from 1967. Such a Gorgeous Kid Like Me by Henry Farrell of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane fame. And this story is told through a series of transcripts recorded by the main character, who's an associate professor of sociology and has gone to a woman's prison to interview inmates for a study. And he meets Camilla Bliss, who's been imprisoned for murder. And she manages to seduce him and convince him of her innocence. And he manages to work her case and get her released. And she's an up-and-coming singer and pop star who is a firm believer in fate and pre-planned destiny. But she manipulates fate to her advantage and to further her career, and people get killed. And eventually, some things go down, and as fate would have it, our guy ends up wrongfully accused and ends up in prison himself. And when the situation is reversed and Miss Bliss can clear his name, she won't. She says it's fate. And her career is starting to take off, and she wouldn't want to interfere with fate. And from prison, he sees her on TV being praised for sponsoring a park or something like that. But in reality, all she's done is bulldoze over all the evidence that could clear his name. But she comes to visit him in prison and plays him her new music. It's a stressful comedy, but it is interesting because you're reading everything that this sociology professor has collected for his study. So it's all letters and transcripts and his own notes. And I'll show you another one like this. This is The Primal Screamer by Nick Blinko. And this is a psychiatrist's diary that he's kept over the years on one of his patients. And it says it best on the back: a gothic horror novel about severe mental distress and punk rock. So it's in the vein of disturbing books, but it's a quick, interesting read. And Nick Blinko's the founding frontman of British punk band Rudimentary Peni, and he's also an artist, and this is his art on the cover and throughout the book. And this edition is from 2012, but it was originally published in 1995. And this is a first edition from 1993 of the Canadian punk rock classic Hardcore Logo by Michael Turner. And this one takes a scrapbook approach, and tells its story through a collection of diary entries and transcribed voicemails and letters and all kinds of photos and contracts. And it tells of the second rise and fall of a punk band who reunite to do a charity event for a new recycling program and then decide to go on tour after. But it's a fast and effective read, and this is published by Arsenal Pulp Press out of Vancouver, Canada. And so is this one from 1988. This is Starting Small by James Dunn, and I've not read this one yet, but it says, meet Blind Banana Daiquiri, man of many colors. A struggling guitarist accused of schizophrenia, he spends his nights performing his greatest hits as mood music for strip shows. And I guess he's an outsider in a land of 4.5-foot cave dwellers who teach him some life lessons. And this was the winner of the 10th annual Pulp Press 3-day novel writing contest, which still happens every Labor Day long weekend. But just real quick, while we're still looking at punk fiction, what's allergic to milk, collects comics, sells speed, likes the fall, and lives in Brixton? Well, that's I'll Be Starvation, of course. And this is a crazed comedy of Brixton lowlife, drugs, and martial arts. And this isn't really music fiction, but punksploitation. And it's gritty, it's funny, it's counterculture, and it has that right level of magical realism in it that I like. And enough punk shows and reggae music to get it on a list like this. And it's called Milk, Sulfate, and I'll Be Starvation by Martin Miller from 1987. And out of this whole list, I give this one the highest recommendation. I'd like to talk more about this one in the future, but for now, we must move on. And one more trade paperback before we get back into the mass market stuff. And this is The Commitments by Roddy Doyle. This is a music fiction classic from 1988, and this is a movie tie-in edition from 1991. And I've talked about this book on this channel before. Yeah, it's great. The movie is good. The soundtrack for the movie is good. So definitely check this one out if you're into this sort of thing. And these next few I have not read yet. This is Rock and Roll Retreat Blues by Douglas Kent Hall from 1974. And I could have guessed that from the back. Endless plastic motels and plaster casters, glittering groupies and exotic mind-altering drugs, a pack of Hell's Angels and a mad bomber. So that sounds like it'll be right up our alley. And here's another one by a Canadian author, The Abramsky Variations by Morley Torgov from 1977. And apparently it's music themed, and apparently it's a comedy too, so I look forward to checking that out. And this is another Canadian Paperbacks from Hell classic from 1989. This is Ghoul by Michael Slade, who is a criminal lawyer who specializes in insanity. And this has a blurb from Alice Cooper on the front, who I've seen. I can't remember when, but Kill Bill came out on stage in her yellow motorcycle outfit, and Alice Cooper violently beat her in a sword fight. It was pretty awesome. I look forward to this. I've had it for a while, and I've been meaning to get to it. I know there's a bunch of rock novels and paperbacks from hell that I always have my eye out for. So I'll have to get to this one soon. This would be perfect for something like Rocktober. But I think the next music-themed fiction that I'm going to read is going to be Memphis Blues by Brett Howard, published by Holloway House in 1984. And this is historical fiction about the rise and fall of Beale Street in its heyday. And Beale Street, Memphis, is known as being the home of the blues and the birthplace of rock and roll. And I've read this author before. I've read The Baroness of Harlem from 1981. And this also was historical fiction. It was like a Harlem Gothic kind of romantic tragedy. But the author has a way of injecting history lessons straight from the textbook into his storyline. And it seemingly comes out of nowhere at first, kind of jarring actually. But once I got into it and started reading more and kind of getting in tune with where this author's coming from, it really worked. You know, it kind of like how history happens in real life, kind of comes out of nowhere. And this was kind of more of an overall 20th century historical fiction. But I think if this one here is going to be focusing on the Memphis Blues, it definitely has potential to be very interesting. So yeah, this is going to be the next one that I read. But that about does it for Rocktober. But if you can recommend anything similar to what you've just seen, please say so in the comments. And I'm always looking for this stuff, and I have some other music-themed novels that didn't make the cut for this video, so maybe there'll be a rock and roll part 2 in the future. And like I say, some of these I'd like to talk more about, so stay tuned, and thanks for watching. I'll sign off now. Over and out.